show up for our classrooms. I just want to say Athena, she showed up for that first class that I taught at Harvard.
It was amazing.
Although I really don't know what we're going to do with that piece, so before I start crying, I will proceed with my actual remarks. So the theme beyond representation, I was thinking a little bit about how each of us in our disciplines might approach that a little bit differently. So we might think about historical representation. For example, the erasure of certain histories from American history, from global history, and Erika has done amazing work to rectify that. Taeku's work on political representation, right? Really thinking about our electorate, electoral politics. For me, as somebody in the arts and humanities, I'm really concerned with cultural representation, right? How we see ourselves or not, perhaps, in film, in literature, television shows, in music. And so where I wanted to take the idea of beyond representation was into the classroom and what some of my students really think about, right, when we sit together in a seminar room or a lecture hall. And one part of what frequently comes up in our discussion is actually the idea that the representation is a burden, right? The burden of racial representation, the kind of burden that might come with being an Asian American artist or being labeled an Asian American artist, the burden that comes with feeling that maybe you're part of a theatrical season or part of a publishing house's repertoire because they get to check, right, a box. And so those are some of the questions and concerns that students bring, and I like to think about the classroom as a space where we can unpack that a bit, right? And I see that every classroom, and I think especially arts and humanities classrooms, as spaces, or as really like space and time. That's what we provide to our students. And so some of the ways that we tackle these concerns that students bring about that burden of representation is to think about how other writers, other artists, theater makers have actually used that burden to innovate, to create better plays, to create more interesting plays, to create doubles of themselves, like Viet Thanh Nguyen did, to create theater that's kind of wild and doesn't make sense, but that's how you deal with that racial burden. Another thing that we talk about in class is how, in fact, we can be a part of that lineage, right? How we can think about our stories in conversation with those who have written before. And I think the students also are thinking about how that space itself, right? How having time to think carefully about a play, think carefully about a novel, think carefully about a poem. When you have an hour, right, that you spend with one of these works, it's no longer about this, checks a box. Okay, we've had the Asian American writer come through. You can no longer reduce a work of poetry to, okay, I read my play by an Asian descent person. When you spend an hour with any kind of work like that, you begin to unpack its complexity. I think you do real justice to the artists who have spent their time producing that for us to enjoy. And so I think that's where they begin to think about, if I am writing my college application or an application to another job, or I'm writing a novel or a play, what is the kind of audience that I want receiving this work? What are the ways that I want them to make space and time for that? So because I'm going to stretch this metaphor as far as I can, I think of the classroom itself as a kind of box, right? As a box that can seem burdensome, especially on midterms and finals, but it is the kind of space where we gather and make community, and where the label Asian American can no longer, can be something more than limiting, right? It can be actually a way to gather together and think about things without perhaps holding onto that burden so tightly. But beyond the classroom, we're going to have this amazing performance, musical, being developed by Julia, the amazingly talented Julia Rue, and all the performers who totally blow my mind. I say like Natalie, Ian, Carolyn. I hope I didn't miss anybody. So Julia was one of the founders of ASAP, which some of you might know about. That happened, I think, about 7 years ago. 5 years ago. And let me say that this arts organization for Asian Americans on campus has been absolutely transformative. We have Julie here, with Karina, our recent president here, sort of bookending all of that. But I just want to say they've created that box, right? They've created a box labeled Asian American or Asian, where students can go and find creative expression, find freedom, find joy and pleasure, debate issues, and make really incredible things. So I feel like my time might be I think my time actually is up. So I just want to say as a last note that, finally I just want to point right to this last gathering here with the H4A, and to really think about, again, I think we always want to be critical about labels and to think about what Asian American has meant historically, what it might mean in the future. But it's really gatherings like this that I think help us think about that future and move towards it in a way that feels right for justice, that feels right for peace, and that really feels right for our community. So thank you.
First, let me start by just adding my voice to the chorus of appreciation for everybody who helped to put this summit together. I often like to remind my children as an immigrant that English is not my first language. And one consequence of that is I actually tend to sound more coherent, which is to say more intelligent when I read from prepared remarks rather than speak extemporaneously. So my apologies for that. I'm also genuinely honored to be able to say a few things to all of you, share a few thoughts about what it means to tackle the theme beyond representation, and what an incredibly timely moment it is, I think, for H4A to tackle this topic. Also, as an immigrant, as an Asian American, I'm not that comfortable talking about it myself, so I'm going to wax a little professorial for my 3 to 4 minutes. What I mean by that is, I'm a political scientist, so politics, like rust, never sleeps. So even on a Friday afternoon, when I think about what lies beyond representation, what I think about is power. How can Harvard's Asian American Alumni Association build genuine, lasting power here at Harvard and out in the world? I think that is the question that all of you should try to tackle and find a common answer to over this weekend. And power is a really elusive concept, but it is a defining concept for political science as a discipline. Economists, they want to maximize utils, whatever those are. And evolutionary biologists, they want to maximize inclusive fitness. I'm not really sure what that is either. Political scientists, we want to maximize power. And I think all of you, in some sense, have an intuitive understanding of what that means. So how do we think about power as the thing that H4A should aspire to gain beyond the numbers and beyond the visibility? The first cut at a power analysis for political scientists is to differentiate between 3 dimensions of power, which are imbricated like layers of an onion or like a Matryoshka doll. And the outer layer is visible power. The fact that so many of you are here today, able to celebrate your successes as alumni of the most exclusive and prestigious university in the United States, that is visible power. The fact that I'm able to talk to you today as a Bay family professor of government, and not the James Conan Bryant professor of government, or the Charles William Eliot professor of government, that too is a manifestation of visible power. But visible power often is not enough, as I'm sure all of you know. So the second layer of power for political scientists is hidden agenda-setting power. Political scientists like to say that some issues get organized into politics, and some issues get organized out of politics. And I think for most of the 52 years of struggle here at Harvard, ethnic studies and Asian American studies has not really been high on the agenda of key decision makers here at Harvard. But today it is, and that is agenda-setting power. And that's also a reminder that as we have transitioned in terms of leadership here at the university, it is absolutely vital for H4A, for Harvard Ethnic Studies Coalition, to continue to insist that ethnic studies and Asian American studies remains high on the agenda of Harvard University. The third kind of innermost layer of power is what political scientists call invisible power. Power as knowledge. Power as the power to shape what you think and how you reason. We all know somebody, maybe even somebody in our family or our closest friends, who is steadfast in their view that Asian American really isn't a coherent thing, so why study it? We all know somebody for whom they are steadfast in their view that initiatives like building an Asian American Studies program or an ethnic studies program at Harvard invariably involves trade-offs between excellence and representation, between quality and diversity, and so on. And I don't want to argue the merits of those points of view, other than to say they are widespread and deeply ingrained views, even here at Harvard among my colleagues, that have real implications for the ability of a group like H4A to build power. Now, efforts to build ethnic studies and Asian American studies historically have squarely taken aim at this third facet of power, power as knowledge. And I think those efforts are just as important today in a world that is rife with fake news, filter bubbles, algorithmic intelligence, and so on, as they ever have been. And having tenured faculty at Harvard like Jian, myself, and Erika creates a space for Asian American students to become empowered through knowledge that I assume most of you may not have had when you were here. The last thing I'll say is that these three dimensions about power, think about power as power over, as zero-sum power. When a group like Asian Americans rise up in visibility and numbers, it necessarily means that another group has to fall down. When the demand for Asian American studies makes it on Harvard's agenda, some other important issue that we all care about has to fall down. And I think most of us would agree, especially in light of the Students for Fair Admissions v. Harvard decision, that this is a very limiting way to think about power and why we care about it. So in addition to power over, please also think about power to and power with, agency and solidarity. And this is, I think, really where moments like this H4 Summit can really build into movements for Asian American power at Harvard and beyond. Building coalition with others, elevating common, complex humanity. I'm just taking off of some of the content for the conference. Telling our stories, all of them, and then organizing, always organizing. That is how you activate power to and power with, and truly move beyond representation to build collective power.
Hi, can everybody hear me? Okay, great. Hello, before I begin, I just want to clarify two things. One, my phone is here not because I'm checking text messages, but because I want to make sure I stay on time. And second, I did not actually get my master's in 18 from Harvard. That's actually what I got tenure as a weird quirk. Tenure, you get to be at home, so I will be with you forever. And also, before I begin, I just want to say, Jeannie and Athena and Eleanor, oh my gosh, three really incredible women. I don't think any of us would be here without Jeannie and her tireless, decades-long work for ethnic studies at Harvard. One argument I've occasionally heard against having more ethnic studies is that students...
In the last slide, which I'm not sure I appreciate, but I also realized sitting here that this is my first official Harvard thing. And there are many, many, many people to thank. First of all, Jeannie and Jane. Renee gave good advice early on. I met Athena and many of the other alumni, Margaret as well, and of course Janice and Joe. Really, I feel, and I think all of us do, that we would not be here without all of you in the room today, but also the generations over the past 52 years. So I'm really excited to be here and to speak with you. I'm also going to read from some notes because 3 to 4 minutes is really tough. You know, we historians we write big books, and so 3 to 4 minutes is a challenge. But when I was thinking about this theme and the question, what does beyond representation mean to me as an academic, the work in history that I do, the publicly engaged scholarship that I do, what I hope to do in the classroom, I thought that this was a perfectly defined framework for what we are all facing as diverse Asian American communities in uncertain times, and also what helps to define what is at stake in the work ahead. So when I think about representation in Asian American history, but also just within our communities and our lives, I think about two sides of the same coin. One is invisibility. Despite its importance to US history, as we all know, I'm sure you can count the number of times that you learned about anything related to Asian Americans in your own K through 12 education. I think many of us do what we do now because we wanted to change that. However, I cannot tell you how frustrated I continue to be when I meet a first year class in my classrooms, and I always ask them, what do we know? I always sort of gauge the population. What do we already know about Asian Americans? I've been teaching a long time, and unfortunately, they still don't know very much because our public institutions, our institutions of primary and secondary learning have not paid attention to Asian Americans. So invisibility remains one of the biggest challenges in teaching about Asian Americans. Without it, we are continuing to spin our wheels. We can't move forward. I have to teach the basics again and again without being able to go deeper and broader in my teaching and learning with undergraduates. Taeku and I are members of the Academic Council. I think that's the name for the status survey on attitudes for Asian Americans, which is supported by TAF. And we pore over this data year after year. There's been a slight improvement in Americans' understanding of history, but one of the biggest nuggets when the survey first happened in 2021 was when we surveyed Americans to name a significant person of Asian American descent. The biggest answer, the answer with the biggest percentage was, quote, don't know. There's been a slight improvement, but there is a lot of work to do. This dismissal of Asian American history in our classrooms has happened alongside the deliberate erasure of Asian American history in our public spaces. I'm right now working on a project that examines race and memory and memorials in Asian American history. And there are some monuments, some National Historic Landmarks that we know of. There are so many that have already been lost. And these are willful acts of erasure and forgetting. And of course then, the other side of the coin is the problem of hyper-visibility. So on the one hand, invisible, but on the other hand, hyper-visible. Hyper-visible as the terrorist threat after 9/11, as COVID spreaders during the pandemic, as model minorities actively dismantling affirmative action, as complicit actors in ongoing police violence targeting Black communities. Jeannie mentioned that I came from Minnesota, and as you know, one of the police officers standing alongside and making possible the murder of George Floyd was Asian American. So these two problems they're nothing new. They have helped to define Asian American studies, Asian American lives for as long as we've been here in the United States. But we're also at a tipping point, and this is where this question of beyond representation becomes so important. The questions before us include, how will we use these newly found, newly fought over, newly won seats of power, new voices? Is it enough to be visible? Is it enough to simply be represented? The stakes could not be higher. In US history, we all know that there is a war being waged against American history. It is a war that pits those who are hostile to an honest portrayal of our country's history, who seek to stamp out the expansive, inclusive, and complicated understanding of America's past that research scholarship has uncovered. This is a fight that's happening in state legislatures, it's happening in our classrooms, it's happening in our books. PEN America has recently reported that there are over 3,600 book bans, many of which are Asian American. The good news is that in the wake of anti-Asian racism and violence, the murder of George Floyd, there has been a new generation of activists who have stood on the shoulders of current and ancestor activists who are demanding that we do more. They're organizing to restore, to preserve, to teach Asian American history, to challenge racism today. Not just history to be represented, but history as a tool, as a necessary tool for social justice today. There's historic levels of activism. I've had the pleasure and honor of interviewing middle school students, high school students, who are learning Asian American history on their own and then testifying before state education committees demanding change. But we must go beyond representation alone in these efforts. I want us all to think about history being an active pursuit, that it's always being created, and it is always in danger of being erased in real time. Learning, engaging with history is an essential part of an engaged citizen of the world. It has power and meaning. This is not just about the past, but it's about creating the future that we want right now and the ones that we want to, and that our children should inherit in the future. Thank you so much.